Everybody at the far end hear that? All right, getting a thumbs up there. And how about the far end over here? Excellent. All right. 150 years ago today, this area known as Hazel Grove was the scene of the largest concentration of Confederate artillery in this battle. Now, although this would become a very prominent Confederate artillery position,
secure the peace.
It was not obvious that that would be so in the very early morning hours of May 3rd, 1863, because the Federal Army held this particular area. Hazel Grove, which sat off in this direction behind most of you and a little bit to the right of many of you, was a huge field. You get very little impression today of the significance of Hazel Grove. It was probably a several hundred-acre farm, and we are standing just on the eastern edge of it, with west being further in that direction. So imagine, as you look in that direction, a huge, wide open field extending significantly further back. And this had been a scene of action several times earlier in the battle than on May 3rd of 1863. On May 1st, for example, Stonewall Jackson and Jeb Stuart were on a reconnaissance mission from the Catherine Furnace further to the south. They came up in this direction toward you, and Union forces holding Hazel Grove at that time gave Jackson and Stuart the first real inclination of the fact that the Federal Army held this area in strength. One of the early, next experiences was on the day of May 2nd, when Stonewall Jackson started his flank march. There were Federal troops up here that climbed up into some of the shade trees around the house Hazel Grove, and from that they could look to the south and see Stonewall Jackson's forces on the march, and again utilized artillery up here on this hill, firing to the south to harass Confederate soldiers as they marched past a particular point. And on the evening of May 2nd, when word came of Stonewall Jackson's flank attack, and many of the forces that had been stationed here had advanced south to the Catherine Furnace, thinking that the Confederates were retreating, and then getting word instead that Confederates were now somehow spotted behind them, Federal soldiers turned around and came back to this location once again. And Alfred Pleasanton, a cavalry division commander, who Bob Crick, our former chief historian here, has labeled Alfred Pleasanton the greatest liar of the war, and appropriately so, lined up several cannon facing to the northwest in that direction, directly behind most of you, firing in that direction, and claimed to bring an end to Stonewall Jackson's flank attack. All of those things happened here. And I should say, to continue on with Pleasanton, he did a good job of selling that to others. When Abraham Lincoln came to review the troops shortly after the battle, Joseph Hooker, Army commander, introduced Pleasanton to Lincoln as the man that saved the Union Army here at the Battle of Chancellorsville. So, when the first minutes of May 3rd ticked away, this plateau was firmly held by a couple of divisions of Federal troops. And many in the Union Army appreciated the significance of holding this particular ground. The Union Army not only had artillery stationed here firing to the northwest, but they also had artillery off in this direction. As you look across the little vista here, if you can very carefully see the far side of the field and the trees that are beyond, if you have good eyes, you can pick out some cannon situated over there. Many of the cannon along that ridge, which is known as Fairview, could fire down the Orange Turnpike and to the area of the Visitor Center. So Union forces holding Fairview, firing down the Orange Turnpike, as well as Union forces holding Hazel Grove, firing up in that direction, could place the Confederates in a crossfire and an enfilading fire. One of the worst situations that you want to be in if you're the recipient of artillery is to be in an enfilading fire situation. Most of you appreciate how vulnerable a flank is, that if you happen to put a cannon at an end of a line so they can fire straight down, that it can do a great deal of damage. And many people also realize that if you got a cannon that is pointed straight on toward a line, it doesn't have a lot of depth to its target, and that the more of an angle that anyone can get from near the flank to fire at a side, the more depth you have to your fire, the greater your target would be. So the fact that we have Confederates subjected to potentially fire from a couple different directions is one of the worst situations that they could possibly be in. And many in the Union Army appreciated this on the morning of May 3rd, but the Army commander, Joseph Hooker, was not among those convinced of this. He, thinking in terms of the fact that not only was Jeb Stuart's command, formerly Stonewall Jackson's command, up in that direction, but Robert E. Lee was further on to the south. And he was thinking, instead of this being an opportunity to hold this position, not only utilize the artillery, as we mentioned, but to keep it as a wedge in between those two forces, that instead he was vulnerable, kind of being stuck between two forces. Joseph Hooker looked at holding Hazel Grove as being vulnerable to being hit from two sides, from Stuart's men up in that direction and Lee's men on off to the south. So in the pre-dawn hours, Joseph Hooker decided to evacuate Hazel Grove. And to point out that this is not a what-if thing. Well, what if the Federal Army could hold Hazel Grove? They had it. They gave it up. And Joseph Hooker, again, early on the morning of May 3rd, would take virtually all the troops from Hazel Grove, pull them back across, and put them predominantly behind Fairview as basically a reserve. And we'll talk a little bit more about the withdrawal of that in a moment. Frank already mentioned some with Archer's command coming through here. But let's, before we talk a little more specifically about this, take a look at the Confederates for this day. It was mentioned already that Jeb Stuart is the man to take over for Stonewall Jackson. Jeb Stuart was in a very difficult situation. He's taking over an infantry command, and he's a cavalry corps commander. He has very little experience in command of infantry. He's taking over some men that he is not familiar with. And of those men, one of the things Frank mentioned is that many of them are not of the proper grade. You'd at least like to have very experienced subordinates that you can work with, but many of these people are performing their jobs now for the very first time. His men are in a very disorganized state. He has not been a part of this attack in the closing phase. Right around 7 o'clock in the evening or so, Jeb Stuart took some cavalry and a little infantry up to the north to try to cut off the Union Army from one of the fords at the Ely's Ford, and then so came back here probably around midnight. And again, with fighting starting at 5 o'clock in the morning, he just did not have a lot of time to get acquainted with an attack that he had not been a part of. So Stuart is faced in a very, very difficult situation, but he realized that the best chance for the Confederate Army was to hope that the Union Army was still in a state of disorganization from the night before, and the best thing for him to do was to attack. He couldn't hardly stay put. He couldn't retreat back the way he had come and widen the gap between he and Robert E. Lee. And he got instructions shortly before dawn. He probably had very little time to make any adjustments once he got his orders from Robert E. Lee, but got orders to initiate the attack and try to work his way toward Lee so that they could try to link up again. Robert E. Lee's goal on the day of May 2nd when he dispatched Jackson was not to have Jackson be separated from him for a lengthy period of time. Robert E. Lee was hoping that Jackson would advance far enough to the east to uncover the front of Robert E. Lee so that they could link up. So, Jeb Stuart, with Stonewall Jackson's command, would now, as mentioned, at 5 o'clock in the morning, move into this area of Hazel Grove. The federal forces that were left behind was a rear guard by that particular point. One of the soldiers that was stationed here was an artillery officer by the name of James Huntington, and he gives a description of what the initial fighting was like from his perspective. So again, Huntington would be off in this direction, facing that way, when some of James J. Archer's mixed Hennessy and Alabama brigade came through, and I'd like to share with you his words. He said, "The men lay by the guns all night, and early on Sunday morning, which is May 3rd, all the artillery was withdrawn except the pieces of Battery H of the 1st Ohio, which were to remain and hold that position." And even though he says all the artillery was removed, he should also add that virtually all the infantry was removed as well, except for the units he's going to mention that supported him. He said 2 regiments of infantry also remained, 1 on each flank. The enemy soon advanced in strong force from the woods in front, where they also had a battery which played on us, while another body moved around our left flank. So the left flank, as he's situated here, is off in that direction. So Archer's men peeling around further to the south. The battery was served as rapidly as possible and kept the front clear. But though the infantry on our left fought gallantly, it was forced back. I ordered the battery to limber to the rear and moved off. Our only line of retreat was down over the hill through a piece of marshy ground and over a bad ditch. As you look in this direction, you can see the ground drops off. The marshy ground he's referring to is that little piece of low ground immediately to your left, and that is also the scene of the marshy ground and the great ditch. He said 2 of the pieces got out, but the horses of the others, being shot and unable to get over the ditch, and again he's referring to that ditch right down there, they were necessarily abandoned. So again, cannon are captured by the Confederates in that ravine right in front of you. Huntington also found on this day a need to do something very interesting and unique. He was running low on the short-range ammunition known as canister, which basically turns a cannon into a giant shotgun. So he decided to put some shells inside the gun without any fuses, so that when he fired the cannon, the flames, the propellant that would throw the projectile out would engulf and immediately ignite the shell, and it could potentially explode in the barrel as having fragments come out. It's not a good thing to want to have your projectiles explode inside the barrel. It can do a lot of damage to the guns. And so I often kind of wonder, having seen him written about this, knowing that some of the guns were captured, wonder how many of them were really serviceable. Not sure how many times he did that on this morning, firing shells without any fuses. But with the Federal Army now abandoning this area, I want to give you a little idea of what their line was like. We've already pointed out the far ridge, and now I can start to even see some traffic going along it. I don't know if you can, there's a semi going from your left to your right. So you can see there the orange turnpike. I couldn't see that when I looked down there a little bit earlier, so we're gradually having some of the fog burn off. But just this side of where you saw the orange turnpike, that is Fairview. That is a place where the Federal Army has approximately 34 guns lined up under a man named Claremont Best, the artillery chief for the Union 12th Corps. And if you look carefully, can you tell that there is a smaller ridge between us and Fairview? In the afternoon, when the sun shines down, it's a lot clearer, but there's a middle ridge. You might even see a little post out there to a right of a trail. The Federal infantry is along that ridge and generally on the reverse slope, a little bit on the other side. So you wouldn't see actually the infantrymen from here. And I think part of the reason for that is to make it a little easier for the Federal artillery to fire over in this direction. But that is now the Union line once Hazel Grove is abandoned. And once Hazel Grove falls, the Confederate Army quickly rushes in here. Even before the morning began, in the cover of darkness, Jeb Stuart could tell that this was an important spot, was anxious to try to take this if at all possible. He turned to E.P. Alexander, an artilleryman, and told him to be ready to crown the hill as soon as they happened to take it. Now, E.P. Alexander is an interesting fellow to be out here. Then the command in this vicinity is Stonewall Jackson's old command, Stonewall Jackson's Corps. E.P. Alexander is a very famous artilleryman. Many of you recognize him and you associate him with what corps? First Corps under James Longstreet. Why is E.P. Alexander not with the portion of Longstreet's corps that is still here with the Army, the two divisions with Robert E. Lee? His value as an artilleryman was appreciated, and he was sent along with the main force, even though it was not part of his regular command. And when Stapleton Crutchfield, the artillery chief of Jackson, went down in the battle, he actually shared an ambulance ride from the battlefield to the field hospital, as some of you may know. Stapleton Crutchfield is wounded, and now E.P. Alexander steps up as the key artilleryman here. He, like Jeb Stuart, is working with people that he's never worked with before. He is not a part of the Second Corps. So it's amazing. We've got two new commanders out here dealing with new personnel and doing an amazing job at it. Well, very quickly, Alexander will have pieces here in this field. Eventually, we think as many as 40. Again, to help appreciate how much bigger Hazel Grove was than what you see today, right now you see 4 cannons spaced out there about the proper distances they should be in firing. Imagine that this field actually had 40 in it. So these guns now start to fire in that direction. There are other Confederate pieces in the vicinity of the visitor center. One of the interesting things that we see around the visitor center and firing down the corridor of the Orange Turnpike, there's so little space that they do something I've never heard of really taking place on another battlefield before, and that is trying to put a row of cannon maybe higher up on a ridge and some others further on down, actually stacking guns so that lines in the rear fire over the top of the men in their front. Apparently they had 2 rows of 4 guns in the turnpike. 8 cannon could fire at a time in that direction. And now, as we discussed before, that if the Union Army continued to hold Hazel Grove, that they would have the Confederates in a crossfire. Now it's the Union Army that's in an intense crossfire. Again, guns here at Hazel Grove firing in that direction, and guns in the visitor center firing at the same angle that you see those vehicles driving across in your horizon. Again, converging fire, a crossfire on the Union Army, and that would be one of the reasons for the Confederate success on this day. One of the Confederate gunners here was a man named Willie Pegram. He declared this a glorious day, Colonel, a glorious day. And for good reason. Many consider this to be the finest day in the history of the Army of Northern Virginia for their artillery. And again, for very, very good reason. So this position now firmly in hands of the Confederates, and not only would they fire at the artillery in that direction, but remember we talked about Robert E. Lee's forces being off to the south. They are confronted by some Union soldiers in the 12th Corps, If you take our drive through the park, many of you have driven by Slocum Drive. There is a drive that starts just a few hundred yards in that direction that goes to the east, merging in with the Orange Plank Road. There are federal forces there facing south. So if there's a line going east and west facing south off in that direction, Confederates here are aware of it. Some of the gunners here are firing shells in that direction, putting pressure on the Union forces facing southward while Robert E. Lee is moving up from the south, putting pressure on them. And eventually that line collapses, and somewhere here in this direction, Jackson's old command under Stuart will merge with Robert E. Lee's forces to the south, and finally the Confederates have united. That only made possible by the Confederates taking Hazel Grove. So in many respects, this is the key to the battlefield on May 3rd, and the Confederates will hold it throughout its duration.
What time?
About what time do the Confederates... Oh, the junction? I would say the junction's probably in the vicinity of 9 to 9:30. That sound good to... Where's Frank at?
Well, that's close enough.
But about that time, the junction would occur, I'd say. All right, yes. Range from here to Fairview, we are about a half mile apart, or about some 800 yards or so. So well within effective range of any type of artillery piece, whether it's a smoothbore gun like Napoleon in front of you, and easy range for any of the rifle pieces. And there's a little controversy, not to jump ahead a little bit, but the Confederates will eventually, of course, take Fairview and start utilizing that to bombard the next Union position around Chancellorsville. But when Joseph Hooker will be struck at the Chancellorsville Inn, there's a lot of folks wonder, and there's an argument over whether those projectiles were fired from a rifle cannon here that could clearly get all the way across there, or whether it's at a later phase when the Confederates are advancing further ahead. But very well within effective range of any type of artillery piece. All right.
Ever come up here before you decided to give up this ground?
The question, a great one. Did Joseph Hooker ever come up here before he decided to abandon this ground? He had been out in this area. Now, interestingly, when the orders were given for the 3rd Corps forces that were up here to pull back, they wanted to object and sent messages to the Chancellorsville Inn. And Joseph Hooker's staff refused to wake Joseph Hooker up to have him consider their objections. All right. So, with this, I think, yes, sir.
Do you think Hooker was thinking about Fredericksburg?
Question is, do you think Joseph Hooker was thinking about Fredericksburg and the wall? There is a very good theory that, and one of the things that I think we all want to do is give these soldiers benefit of the doubt and hope that they utilize some kind of logical thought in their decision-making process. Joseph Hooker may have walked away from the Battle of Chancellorsville thinking, walk away from the Battle of Fredericksburg thinking, because of the kind of weapons that we have, because of the tactics that we are employing, and because of communications, maybe the best way to win a battle is to fight a defensive battle. And just elaborate a little bit on what Joseph Hooker wants to do on this day, because it's the opposite of the beginning of the campaign. Keep in mind, again, there is a Union force in Fredericksburg under John Sedgwick. Originally, John Sedgwick was to be the anvil, if you will, to Joseph Hooker coming in from the west with the main punch. I like to compare it with a sledgehammer that Joseph Hooker has moving against John Sedgwick in Fredericksburg, and to try to sandwich the Confederates in between. On this day, while Joseph Hooker decides to go on the defensive out here, not only does he seem to wish to allow Robert E. Lee to continue to try to batter him down, but he's turned to John Sedgwick and said, Sedgwick, you move west from Fredericksburg, brush aside the Confederates in front of you, easier said than done, and you march out here and you come up and you strike Robert E. Lee in the rear. So now Joseph Hooker has become the anvil and John Sedgwick the hammer. Only rather than referring to a sledgehammer, I would refer to Sedgwick coming against Hooker as a ball-peen hammer, coming against this new anvil. So that is Joseph Hooker's overall plan for the day, apparently. I'm going to fight a defensive battle, at least let the Confederates wear down. There's some speculation that at the moment that he was wounded, he might have felt that the Confederates have worn themselves down enough to unleash some forces. We don't have handouts and maps here, but George Gordon Meade with the Union 5th Corps is sitting up to the north of us, and it would be in a prime position to come down and crash into Jeb Stuart's flank at any moment in the day. And some speculate that just about the time the Confederates had spent all their attacks, he might have been in position to unleash Meade, but nobody was told that overall plan. His plan for the day, as he expressed it, he's to be the anvil for Sedgwick coming up in rear of Robert E. Lee's forces. Okay, so with that, we will move on. I think Beth has our next stop, and we'll be moving on to the Middle Ridge. Correct, Beth? Yep. Okay.
Now I can walk it.
In the woods, you're still grappling with the life and death struggle throughout the woods. Most of you right in front of you. Woods, Confederate forces being thrown from about where we began the tour into the woods, and they will clash and seesaw back and forth through the woods for most of the morning. The first group to be thrown in from this sort of area would be Gershon Mott's men. They're originally in the second line and then thrown forward. And so about 7 a.m., they have a brisk encounter with North and South Carolinians, and then they're forced to fall back. Farther to the north of us, from where we stand here today, we have a very wonderful account from a man named Bryce Bull, a member of the 123rd New York, who left us again a fantastic account. He wrote, and I think this was rather fitting of our sunrise this morning, though perhaps not quite so true right now. He said, "Never was there a more beautiful sunrise, not a cloud in the sky. It was an ideal Sunday morning, warm and fair. It seemed to me like sacrilege that such a sacred day should be used by men to kill and maim each other." As they prepared for battle, fighting in these woods, Bryce described the men meeting their first major engagement. He said, "I could see pallor on every face as we brought the hammers to a full cock. I believe every arm trembled as we raised our guns to our shoulders to fire, but all eyes were to the front, not one looked back. They met the onrush and said it was then load and fire at will as fast as we could. Soon the nervousness and fear we had when we began to fight passed away, and a feeling of fearlessness and rage took its place." One of Bull's comrades, also in the 123rd New York, wrote of an oncoming Confederate attack and said they appeared in one solid mass of living gray. The whole woods in front of us seemed to be full of them. The Confederates would come forward and then fall back. But it would only be for a moment, as the empty places in the enemy's ranks would be filled, and on they would come again. And so Mott's men surge forward past the 123rd line, but they're pushed back, and fighting again swings back to the Confederate forces, largely Virginians and North Carolinians to be thrown forward at this point. A few South Carolinians mixed in as well. Perhaps most famously, and what becomes, I believe, the most iconic charge here in the woods, is led by 25-year-old Brigadier General Stephen Dodson Ramseur. He's in command of North Carolinians, and he throws them forward after first trying to rally a body of men lying down on the ground in front of him. Of course, anytime you're trying to throw men into a fight, you want as much support as you can possibly get. Ramseur tries to rally these men, have them join his men as they go forward, but they refuse. T.J. Watkins of the 14th North Carolina wrote, "We found the Stonewall Brigade lying flat on the ground, making no effort to succor our artillery with the enemy near our guns. It was then General Ramseur ordered us to run over them, not using Sunday school words." Of course, the proud Stonewall Brigade will soon go to great lengths to prove that this is not their men lying down on the ground, but is instead a different group of Virginians who perhaps didn't want themselves to be identified as themselves. They're truly from John R. Jones's brigade. Ordered forward, these men walk right over the prone line. One man, William Calder, the 2nd North Carolina, wrote, "The brave, chivalric Virginians." Do we have any Virginians in this group, by the way? All right. Do we have any North Carolinians? Perhaps the better question. A few. All right. "The brave, chivalric Virginians lay flat on the ground, and the Tar Heels, whom they so often ridicule, walked over them to glory and to victory." Some took a little bit greater offense to the Virginians' refusal to move forward, and then used more creative solutions, like Colonel Brian Grimes, commander of the 4th North Carolina. He wrote, "I myself put my foot on the back and head of an officer of high rank in mounting the work, and through very spite, ground his face in the earth." Consider for a moment what it must feel like to be charging forward without support, and just how absolutely angry you would be at these men who refuse to help you. They're your comrades. They're supposed to be supporting you, but instead they're lying down on the ground, hugging the earth for their very lives. But then again, would you rather be stepped upon, or would you rather charge back into the face of your enemies? I have no desire to see my face ground into the dirt, but it could seem like a better alternative, considering what it is you're facing. As the North Carolinians moved forward through the woods, a voice called out to Grimes pretty ominously, saying, "You may double quick, but you'll come back faster than you go." Doesn't exactly bode well. These Virginians who are hugging the earth are doing it for a reason, and that is that they've gone forward, met pretty hard fighting, and had to fall back themselves. Ramseur will lead his men personally, as recounted by William C. Brewer of the 2nd North Carolina, who wrote, "I shall never forget the scene when General Ramseur took a position in front of his brigade, composed of the 2nd, 4th, 14th, and 30th Regiments, North Carolina troops, drew his sword, waved it over his head, and cried out, 'Men, will you follow me?' Every man arose at the sound of his voice, and then the command, 'Forward, charge!' The only charge on the enemy they ever made without the yell, silent as specters. Every man in the brigade knew we were being sacrificed. A look of grim determination to their duty was on every face." You imagine making a charge in absolute, utter silence. Yelling is many times what drives these men forward. It encourages them, gives them something to do while they're rushing forward to their enemy. But they went forward silent as specters, with a grim look of determination to their duty. This isn't a glorious charge, except perhaps in hindsight. This is a bitter, very determined kind of clash instead. Brewer continued, "We arrived at the top of the ridge, about 40 yards from the trenches. They poured a galling fire into us from the infantry in grape and canister from the battery. The noise and carnage of battle was deafening. I looked up and down the line, saw nothing but dead and wounded. I looked back from whence we came, and saw a thin line like skirmishers vanishing over the hill. A shock, and I knew no more. Surrounded by dead and wounded, Brewer himself becomes a casualty. He survives his wound and, of course, writes his memoir, which is how we have this great account. But Ramseur here is taking enfilading fire, is soon, however, supported by the actual Stonewall Brigade, but cannot hold on to his advanced position, and like so many other units thrown forward in this seesaw fighting, must fall back himself. In the course of this glorious charge, as he's falling back now, Ramseur's men are greeted by Jeb Stuart, who has been setting an example of personal courage all over this field. He sees Ramseur's men come back. As soon as he identifies who they are, he knows what they've done, and says 3 cheers for Ramseur's brigade. Men, you have done your duty. There's that word again, duty. What does duty mean at this stage in the game? Here, it might mean a little bit of glory. Certainly Jeb Stuart is offering these men glory and acclaim. But it also means very heavy loss. As the men reform, Ramseur comes upon, the 2nd North Carolina and asks, "Is that all that's left?" And the commanding officer responds, "This is all, sir." Ramseur bursts into tears and can't think of anything to say but, "Men, I love you." What more can he say? These are his men. He feels the weight of leading these men into battle. He knows when he does that, he's leading many of them to their deaths, others to be maimed. The 2nd North Carolina alone lost 214 killed or wounded out of 340 men. The brigade as a whole, Ramseur's North Carolinians, lost 623 out of 1,400. These are staggering losses. John A. Strikeleather, member of the 4th North Carolina, later wrote, "North Carolina poured out more of her precious blood on that sanguinary field than she did on any other field during the contest. Tears over their unmarked graves is a more fitting tribute to their precious memories than any other that we can bring." Strikeleather's entire writings on this battle are very much moving. He doesn't describe the battle very much in depth, but he talks entirely about the men. About such men that he was so proud to have served with, and so many of them lost right here on the field. Adding to the horror of the fighting in these woods are fires that soon break out. James F. Huntington, who has a battery here on the field, described the scene. He said, "The inevitable horrors of a fiercely contested battlefield were increased by a fire that broke out about noon in the woods near the position lately occupied by Berry's division. Scattered through them were hundreds of helpless men from both the contending parties. The Confederates, who then held the ground, did all in their power to extinguish the flames and rescue the sufferers. In spite of their exertions, many wounded perished miserably in this fire-swept wilderness." Major Eugene Blackford of the 5th Alabama Battalion watched from Hazel Grove as fires caught here in the woods. He said, "All the Yankees were burnt to death by the burning leaves, which the shells set afire. The sight was perfectly horrible, enough to make one's hair turn gray. The whole atmosphere was impregnated with the odor of burning flesh. I am sick of horrors now." I believe that any person who visits a battlefield could easily say in the aftermath that they are sick of horrors. But soldiers, veterans who are hardened to battle, to them even what they witnessed here was terrible. "I am sick of horrors now," he said. These men are fighting in woods against an enemy that they often can't see. They're hammering away at each other, not trying to capture a clear objective, not easily making it to any one point, and instead fighting back and forth. So where is the glory? Stuart seemed to offer Ramseur's men, again, a great amount of acclaim. 3 cheers for Ramseur's brigade. You think any of the men felt like cheering as they returned? In this kind of a scene, who wouldn't end up being a little bit war-weary? And yet these men press on. It's a great testament to their resolve, to their commitment to their cause, their commitment to the overarching objectives that each of them is fighting for. But at the end of the day, this is also a sign of a war that gets tougher every day. It takes a greater toll on these men every day that they fight it. And because for all of the casualties that we count, remember, one casualty for every second that we've been talking so far this morning. One casualty per second. But as we walk away and walk on to our next stop, where I believe Frank will be leading us, I want you all to think about whether any of these men weren't casualties from what they saw here. The horrific scene that each of these men saw. Let's move on.